this video, I'm going to present you with a complete repertoire as black against 1d4. Now, if you like to play safe, solid chess, trying to equalise passively with the black pieces, well, I suggest you ask for your money back, because what I'm proposing to you here is an extra sharp and double-edged new system known as the Clarendon Court. The opening has the big advantage of being practically unknown, so if you watch this video, you'll know more about it than almost anybody who hasn't. So what is the new Clarendon Court defence? After white opens with 1d4, you attack the centre at once with c5, and if white presses on with 2d5, black continues with the surprising move f5. It's not completely new. There is one small note on it in the 5-volume ECO, referring to a Russian game from 1971, which continued 3 knight c3, knight f6, 4 bishop g5, queen b6, 5 rook b1, d6, when after 6 knight h3 white got a big edge. My new idea is to play 5 h6 instead of 5 d6, so that if white takes the knight, then black can recapture with the queen and keep his pawn structure intact. This is the main line, which I'll be looking at in detail later. Apart from a couple of other games in the late 80s, that's about it theoretically, until my own game with Lev Albert from the New York Open in 1994 made it into Informer 60. Since then, Russian Grandmaster Tukmakov has also used the system to defeat Laputin. One word of warning: with a brand new super sharp system starting on move 2, there's always going to be some danger. You can't have everything. Black can get a weakness on the e6 square, but I believe this to be quite manageable, and you should get plenty of counter chances. I've played the defence a number of times already in tournaments this year, and on every occasion I've gained time on the clock, and none of my opponents, including 2 Grandmasters, have been able to refute the opening. I've also analysed it at home, of course, and I'll be showing you plenty of original analysis as we go along. Incidentally, Fritz 3 has been unable to find anything wrong with it either. In fact, against Fritz on a fast Pentium computer, I usually get completely winning positions out of the opening with black. I don't always win them, but that's another matter. After d4, c5 is the move I'm recommending. The most aggressive white reply is d5, which is almost certainly the critical move. And now we're already in the Clarendon Court. Black plays f5. There are 3 approaches that white can try when you play this opening. You can attempt to blast you off the board immediately with moves like e4 or even h4. There is the positional approach with g3, fianchettoing the king's bishop, and there is the sharpest and most critical line: 3 knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5. Finally, after c5, white does not have to advance the d-pawn. You have to be ready for passive moves like e3, c3, or knight f3, or for the slightly more aggressive e4, or even for d takes c5. But none of these moves pose a real threat, and I'll be giving you a fairly convincing way of dealing with them. When you play the Clarendon Court, there are various strange ways white can react from the very start. I'd like to deal with these first of all, since they should actually be quite good fun for black. Grandmaster Matthew Sadler played the slightly bizarre h4 against junior David Moscovich at Islington, London 1994. After knight f6, h5, he went on to win an amusing game. But I don't believe that losing so much time in the opening pushing the h-pawn can be a good idea for white. Moscovich played e6, but I think a much better move is b5, preparing to round up the d5 pawn with bishop b7. I think black is fine in this position. The advanced h-pawn is looking a bit irrelevant, and white has already got some problems defending his centre. Against the Dutch defence, white sometimes likes to gambit a pawn with e4, which is known as the Staunton Gambit. Similarly, in the Clarendon Court, white can try to play 3 e4. It's certainly more dangerous than h4, I think. Black must take it. F takes e4. White continues knight c3, and black should play knight f6. This is what happened the first time I played the Clarendon Court proper, at the New York Open in 1994. There were already several possibilities for white here. My opponent, J. Eugene Salomon, continued with bishop g5, d6, and now he wanted to get his pawn back, so he played bishop takes f6, and I recaptured with the e-pawn, and after knight takes e4, bishop e7, black is probably about equal already, and I went on to win a smooth ending with the two bishops in 47 moves. Anyway, white's idea of giving away the e-pawn, only to give up the two bishops a moment later to get it back, is not really very inspiring. A much more interesting way to play is 5g4, and in fact Toshkov-Kuczynski, one of the almost historical games with this opening, it was played in St. John 1988, went as follows. h6, that's to stop white dislodging the knight with g5. Bishop g2, and now black made a mistake with e5, because white was able to go h4, which prepares g5, kicking the knight around, and black couldn't really stop that happening. Instead of e5, a better move would have been d6, which attacks the pawn on g4, which stops white from going h4, because black could simply take the g-pawn. Instead, white has to go h3, and now black can go back to his old plan with e5. And the position's probably about equal. White shouldn't take the pawn en passant, because after black replies d5, he defends his e-pawn on e4 and prepares to capture the white e-pawn on e6 next. Black would be doing very well there. So by playing the moves in the right order, black's reached this position, where because white's advanced on the king's side a little early, the black squares, in particular f4 and g5, are a touch weakened. If things go well, black might get the moves bishop e7, knight b8 to d7, knight f8, knight g6, and knight to f4 in one day. After e4, f takes e4, knight c3, knight f6, another completely untested idea is f3, offering a gambit pawn. I really don't know what's happening if black accepts the pawn, it's just unclear, but black can probably more safely go e3. This stops white getting a lead in development and slows down the game. Black can continue with the plan d6, and then g6 and bishop g7, and he should have a fairly acceptable position. Whenever I play the Fritz 3 program on my Pentium computer, it plays the rather weird move, 3 queen d3. This attacks the f-pawn, but after d6, I think the queen is just misplaced on d3. Perhaps the computer has been programmed to overrate the weakness of the pawn on e7. It is a backward pawn on an open file. But the whole point of the Clarendon Court is that usually white can't exploit this weakness, and so it isn't really a weakness. In some of my blitz games against the machine, Fritz has continued with the plan knight c3, bishop f4, fianchettoing the king's bishop with g3 and bishop g2, and then castling queenside. These moves don't coordinate very well, and in reply I've played something like g6, bishop g7, knight f6, castling kingside, and then expanding all my queenside pawns with a6 and b5 with a nice slow burning attack, just the sort of thing you want against a machine. Much more dangerous than queen d3 is to continue with 3 knight c3, knight f6, and now to play f3. In fact, this has never been played, though I've analysed it at some length with German international master Eckhard Schmidt-Diel. First we thought it might be a complete refutation of the Clarendon Court, but eventually we found the antidote. The idea is to build up in the centre with e4, and if black captures, to capture back with the pawn, and have the pawn break e5 later. Normal moves are bad for black. For example, if black continues d6, white goes e4. After the exchange in the centre, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Black has a problem. He needs to develop the bishop on f8, so he goes g6. And now white can play bishop b5 check. And, well, whatever black does here, he's in real trouble. If he goes bishop d7, the white squared bishops are going to come off, and later the e6 square will be very vulnerable to, for example, to white's knight on g1, going to f3, to g5, and then to e6. Alternatively, if black goes knight bd7, the e6 square this time isn't so weak because black's maintained his bishop on c8, but the problem is that after knight f3, the pawn break e5 is pretty unstoppable. White can support it with bishop c1 to f4, and if white gets e5 in, and he's going to, black's in real trouble. So the way black should reply against 4f3 is with a complete change of plan. He should play e5. Now the first point is if white captures this pawn en passant, d takes e6 en passant, black doesn't take back, he plays the slightly surprising move d5. And shortly he'll take back the pawn on e6 with his bishop. And white's move f3 is looking very strange here. Black's got a pretty good game. After e5, white should play e4. Now, a normal looking move for black here is d6. This is actually a mistake. White can go bishop b5 check. And now, however you interpose on d7, there's a slight problem with the pawn on f5. Instead of d6, black should play, and I think he must play in fact, f4, gaining space on the king's side. White can counterattack with g3, and now black has two possibilities. One is to gambit a pawn with d6, white captures on f4, now black plays knight h5, preparing queen h4 check. White's best here is bishop b5 check. Black plays knight d7. And now white can capture on e5 with the pawn. Black plays queen h4 check. White plays king f1. And now a mistake would be knight g3 check. When white would capture on g3, black captures on h1, and white plays e6. Winning the knight on d7. Better is to play pawn takes pawn, when, although black's a pawn down after, say, queen e1, queen f6, he's got quite a good development. He wants to go bishop d6, castle kingside, a6, and the problem for white is his king on f1's not very good. And it's just a murky, difficult position, with white a pawn up, but black having quite good play. The other possibility is to play 6 knight h5, which doesn't gambit a pawn. Now the disadvantage of this is that white could try to play d6 himself before black does. After d6, black can take on g3, white could play queen d5 here, and black's got queen f6. And Fritz, certainly for one, reckons this position's fine for black. The conclusion from all this home analysis is that an early e4 by white, with or without f3, poses no serious threat to black. In fact, he has very good chances to get the advantage, although I don't want to make any really definitive judgment since the territory is so uncharted. Now we're going to look at what happens if white plays positionally, by fianchettoing his king's bishop with g3. It's most flexible to play it at once, leaving open the option of whether to play c4 or just to play knight c3, leaving the c-pawn at home on c2. In these lines, the play is similar to the Leningrad Dutch, only with c5 and d5 thrown in. As in that recently popular opening, black gets a weakness on e6, but the big question is, can white exploit it? After a few typical moves, for example, knight f6, bishop g2, d6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, we see what we mean about this weakness on e6. It's right in the middle of the black camp and rather out of reach of most of white's pieces. Generally, black can comfortably keep white out, but if things do go wrong and a white knight ends up on e6, it could be curtains. In a way, it's gambling a lot with very good odds of gaining a little. Normally you'll just get quite an active game and e6 will prove completely irrelevant, but sometimes you'll just lose out of hand. However, provided black is careful, the chances of disaster should be very, very small. Before we look at a couple of my games in this line, I just want to discuss some general ideas in the position, in particular which squares the pieces should be aiming for. Black nearly always fianchettos his king's bishop and castles kingside. His knight on the kingside on f6 usually just stays there for quite a while. His queen can go to e8 maybe, from where it can support b5. Or also possibly later black can play h6, g5, and attack on the king's side with queen g6 or queen h5. A more difficult question is where to put the queen's knight. In fact, this depends on where white puts his king's knight. Often in chess, one side's plans mutually interdepend on the other side's plans. White has two ways to develop his king's knight. He can either go simply to f3, or alternatively he could go to h3 and then to f4, from where he eyes the weakness on e6. Correspondingly, black can either develop knight a6 to c7, where he attacks the d-pawn, defends the square e6, and prepares the advance b5. And the alternative knight development for black is simply knight d7 to e5. In my opinion, if white develops knight f3, black is better off going knight a6 to c7. Partly this is because if the white knight is on f3, it prevents a black knight going to the e5 square. Also, the pawn on d5 is a little bit more of a target with the white bishop on g2 blocked by the knight on f3. Alternatively, if white develops his knight to h3 and f4, a black knight is much safer on the e5 square, so I think black should head knight d7 to e5, because white hasn't got the option of playing f2 to f4. Some care is needed with move order. Notice that after g3, d6, white could play knight h3 at once. And now black should play knight d7 immediately, so as to meet knight f4 with knight e5. If alternatively black played, say, 4g6, white could play knight f4, and now black couldn't play knight d7 because it blocks the bishop on c8 and allows knight e6, and that's disaster for black. Normally, if anything white lands on the square e6, black simply wants to take it and then try and round up the pawn on e6 that results. What about white's plans in this position? I guess the main one is to break with e4. If white does play e4, black should never allow white to play e5 as well. He has to take on e4 first. Let me give you a few sample moves in this position. Bishop g2, knight f6, knight c3, g6, now white plays e4. Here, white isn't threatening e5 yet, so black can simply develop bishop g7. Now, if white takes on f5, the general rule in the Clarendon court is never to take back with the g-pawn. This would be a horrible positional mistake. Bishop takes f5 is much better and leads to an active game. A lot of general comments, but it really is difficult to give precise moves when both sides' plans are so dependent upon each other. What I'm going to do now is show you two complete games, one where white played c4 and one where white just played knight c3. This, in fact, was the move chosen by candidate Grandmaster Keith Arkle in a game we played just yesterday, that is, the day before I recorded this video. I replied with knight f6, and white fianchettoed his bishop with g3. I played d6. White completed the fianchetto with bishop g2, and I fianchettoed my bishop with g6. White now played e4. This is a position we were looking at earlier, in fact. I replied bishop g7, and white chose to take on f5. E takes f5. Now, of course, I didn't break my general rule. I took back with the bishop. Bishop takes f5. White continued knight ge2. Now there is the familiar problem of where to put the queen's knight, whether to go to d7 or to a6. I chose a6 because if knight d7, then white could try h3, and if knight e5, white can push back all black's pieces with first g4, bishop d7, now f4, hitting the knight. Now white was a bit worried about the possibility of knight b4 hitting the sensitive c2 point, so he played the move a3 to prevent this, but this gives black a little bit more time to continue with his plan of knight c7, which is what I played. White castled, and now I had a decision to make, whether just to castle or to exploit the opportunity to play b5. In fact, that's what I did, b5. White replied b4. Now this move prevents black's further expansion on the queen side, and it also threatens to go b takes c5, d takes c5, d6, winning the exchange since the bishop on g2 hits the rook on a8, and the knight on c7 is attacked. However, I ignored this threat and simply castled. This was on the grounds that if white continues with bc5, dc5, d6, I could simply take on d6, e takes d6, and if bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, and on general grounds, the white squares around the king are so weak that black has good play for the exchange. If, for example, queen takes d6, black could play knight f e8, and after, say, queen takes c5, black plays bishop h3, and white's in real trouble here. White wasn't tempted by all this excitement. He simply played rook b1. And now black captured on b4, white recaptured with the pawn, and I played queen d7. Looking at this position, both sides have serious weaknesses. White can try and get in on c6 or e6, for example after knight d4, and black has chances of getting in on the c-file, with the weakened squares c2, c3 and c4. I think it's probably about level, which is something of a success for black. The game continued knight f4, rook a c8, rook e1, and now I expanded on the king side with g5. White retreated, knight f e2, and I defended my g5 pawn with h6. White now tried knight d4. We've got a critical position here. It's necessary to calculate quite carefully here. I played bishop h3, but after knight c6, my pawn on e7 is under attack. It looks as though black's in trouble here, but in fact the position is very deceptive. After the game, my opponent Keith Arkle said that after knight c6 he had reached his dream position, only to discover that he's losing. I played rook c e8, and the point is that after, say, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, knight takes e7 check, black has the slightly surprising move king f7. Instead of king f7, if black played queen takes e7, white would simply play bishop takes h3 and be a pawn up. Here, the knight on e7 is very short of squares. It has to go back to c6, and then black captures on g2, white recaptures, and black plays knight c takes d5. This threatens knight takes c3, and if white plays knight c3 takes d5, black captures on c6, and the pin on the long white diagonal is decisive. After a long think, Keith realised that his dream position was actually something of a nightmare. He came up with bishop h1, but now black played knight g4. This attacks f2 with the knight, and also uncovers an attack by the bishop on g7 on the knight on c3. White continued knight e4, defending against both threats, but now black created a third threat, rook f5. And this attacks the d5 pawn, and white cannot defend it. Black is just winning now. But Keith played on resourcefully. Knight d4. Rook takes d5. c3, defending the knight on d4. And now I couldn't resist the move e5. Actually, it is a good move. White now played a surprising move. Knight takes g5. I recaptured on g5. H takes g5. White played bishop h1 takes d5. I played knight takes d5. And white now played knight f3. And we see that black has two pieces against a rook, but looking at that beautiful bishop on h3 and the exposed white king on g1, it looks like black has a terrific attack. I played the move queen f7, which stops knight takes g5 because of queen takes f2 with mate to follow. It also threatens knight takes c3. White now found the only move to keep the game going. He played rook b2. And now if I play knight takes c3, white could play queen b3, pinning the queen on f7 to the king on g8. White is now threatening knight takes g5, and black's pieces are very uncomfortable here. The bishop on h3, the queen on f7, and if the queen moves, the knight on d5 is very vulnerable. I defended against these problems with bishop h6. White continued knight takes g5. Anyway, I captured on g5, and white captured back on g5. And now came the critical moment of the game. I made a serious mistake. I played rook e8 to c8. What I should have played was rook f8. Then I would have had a one game. I was in quite bad time trouble. After rook c8, white was able to play f3, which really confuses the issue. After a bit of a panic, I played knight takes c3, and with just a minute left on my clock I offered a draw. Keith, with just over 2 minutes on his clock, decided to accept it. The position's just a complete mess now. I consider that quite an interesting game. It was especially instructive the way after knight c6, nearly all the spectators thought white was just winning, but in fact white's in serious trouble in that position, as we showed earlier. Many white players prefer to play these positional lines with the move c4 thrown in before developing the knight on b1. My game against B. Marshall, earlier this year, 1995 that is, continued knight f3, knight f6, and now white played c4. I played g6, white continued g3, white played d6, white completed his fianchetto with bishop g2, black did likewise with bishop g7, and now both sides castled. White castled, black castled. Finally white developed his knight, knight c3, and I decided to go on the a6 to c7 route, knight a6. White played a3, possibly unnecessary. I continued knight c7, and now white broke with e4. This threatens the positionally crushing e5, so I had to stop at that with f takes e4. White continued knight g5, and I played bishop f5, and he captured the e-pawn with the knight on g5. Knight g takes e4. I continued queen d7. After queen e2, I exchanged on e4, knight takes e4, white recaptured with the knight, and now I broke on the queen side with b5. This is a typical break in the Clarendon court. It often activates the rook on a8 along the b file. White responded very badly here. He went knight d2. This awkward little move prevents the development of the bishop on c1. and I continued just rook f7, preparing to double on the f-file. White now wants to play b3, but there's a problem in that the bishop g7 would capture the rook on a1. That explains the ugly looking move rook a2. It's preparing to go b3. I played b takes c4. White recaptured with the queen. And now I exploited the problem that white has along the diagonal a2 to g8 by playing the move e6. This is another typical pawn break in the Clarendon court. You get rid of your weak backward pawn on the e-file and attack the white centre. It doesn't often happen, but when you can get it in, it's useful. Here, white can't capture on e6, because after bishop takes e6, there's major embarrassment for white. Look at his silly rook on a2. Instead, he played b3. I captured on d5, e takes d5. White had to capture back, he went bishop takes d5. And I captured on d5 with the knight, and white captured with the queen. Now, black has the two bishops, and more important, he has the bishop on f5, which is controlling the white squares, which are very weakened. I continued rook e8. White played bishop b2. I played bishop e6, and white played queen back to d3. Now I tried to attack with bishop h3. White went rook d1, and I doubled on the e-file with rook f e7. Black has a clear advantage in general terms in this position, but in fact white now blundered and allowed me an instant finish. He played bishop takes g7. I played rook e1 check, fairly obvious move. Now white has to go knight f1. But I think the move he'd overlooked here was simply bishop takes f1. When after queen d5 check, king takes g7, rook takes e1, rook takes back on e1, white is just completely lost. He went queen d2, and I simply played queen e6, and white resigned. He's a piece down, and there's hardly any defence to the mate along the back rank. Not a particularly good game by white, but it's typical of just how badly even quite good club players will play when faced with a new and original situation, which is exactly what you give them when you play the Clarendon court. In conclusion, I think these lines where white plays positionally with g3 are quite okay for black. He gets a serious weakness on e6, but usually this proves to be inaccessible, and black can develop active piece play. Typically in these positions he castles, plays queen e8, and he can look to play either b5 or possibly h6, g5, and queen h5, with something of a kingside attack. Probably the sharpest and most aggressive white choice is to play 3 knight c3, knight f6, and now 4 bishop g5. There have been 3 all-grandmaster clashes starting with these moves, which just about makes it the main line. Actually, in practice, you may find that a greater number of white players choose to play positionally with g3, the move we've just looked at. But anyway, after 4 bishop g5, black's big idea is to go queen b6, and then there is a parting of the ways. White can offer the b-pawn with queen d2, he can defend it with rook b1, or he can play the immediate bishop takes f6, which was Lapushin's choice when Tukmakov punted the Clarendon court. Dave Norwood has also played this move against me in Blitz. This move saves worrying about whether or not black is threatening to capture on b2, since black replies queen takes f6. Now Lapushin played 6e3, but in his notes to the game, Tukmakov suggested that 6e4 would be interesting, without giving any further analysis. Seems to me that after e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, black can play queen takes b2, and if rook b1, queen d4 is fine. Black's probably better. Another idea is to play 6 knight f3. This was Dave Norwood's consistent choice in several friendly blitz games. After 6g6, white continues e4, black takes, f takes e4, white recaptures, knight takes e4, and if queen takes b2, 9 rook b1 is very dangerous since white gets a big lead in development. After a couple of setbacks with this, I graduated to the more sophisticated g5. White played e4, and after g4, 8e5 loses a pawn to queen g7, since when the knight on f3 moves, say to d2, black can simply play queen takes e5 check. If instead white plays 8 knight d2, black plays d6, and after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, white can play bishop b5 check, to which black plays with another typical move of the Clarendon court, king d8. Sometimes the king can be quite safe on the c7 square. I think black's doing fine in this position. He has active play with the two bishops, and, well, it's a very double-edged game. Returning to the Laputian-Tukmakov game with 6e3, black played g6, which is in fact inaccurate, since it allows white the option of playing d6 himself. But it didn't matter, since white played bishop c4, and black sorted out the problem by playing d6. This is what he should have done last move, when it's very probable it would have transposed back to the game. After 7 bishop c4, d6, 8 knight ge2, black should not play bishop g7, since then white would play knight f4, and if black plays knight d7, white can play knight e6. Tukmakov realised this. He played the more accurate knight d7, so as to meet knight f4 with knight e5. Black's fine in this position. He exploited the two bishops to win a good game in 50 moves. The old ECO recommendation is 5 rook b1, and the new move now is to play h6. In this position, Pettersson played 6 bishop d2 against me when we played in Sicily in 1994. Afterwards, he admitted that the move g6 by black now would give him a comfortable Dutch-type position, probably comfortably equal. However, in typical Clarendon court fashion, I'd gained over half an hour on the clock, and I was feeling a bit too ambitious. Instead of g6, I tried e5, and after e4, I made another mistake by taking on e4. I should have played f4 instead. The game continued knight ge2, bishop e7, knight g3, I castled, and white played the move knight f5. And I lost a horrible game in 28 moves, and I'm not going to show it to you. Anyway, it's clear that bishop d2 isn't a move to worry about, since black can reply g6 with a fine position. Instead, white should play bishop takes f6, when black replies with queen takes f6, and white plays e4. Now black should play d6. I think the position's just very unclear. Black has the two bishops, but white has a slight initiative, and also e6 is weak, as is traditionally the case with this opening. It's very double-edged. Probably more critical is Lev Albert's choice of 5 queen d2, which leads to similar positions, so let's move on and look at that. It's a brave move, since white has to worry about black taking the pawn on b2. Actually, I decided this was a bit too risky. You win a pawn, but white gets the initiative. Instead, I played the move h6. White captured on f6, and black recaptured with the queen, not ruining his pawn structure. White now castled queenside. Instead of that, he could try the move e4, in which case black would take, white would recapture, knight takes e4, and now black can take on b2. And after rook d1, black plays d6, white can try the tricky little move queen e2. This threatens the rather cute knight takes d6 check. However, black can sidestep this in typical Clarendon court fashion with the even sneakier move king d8. I think black's doing rather well here. Anyhow, after white's choice of castles queenside, I played d6. White then went e4. Now white's got to react a little bit violently here and try and open up the position before black's two bishops become a serious factor. White's chances of advantage lie in a quick development. I played g6. The move g5 would have been another option. White continued bishop b5 check. And again, black has probably three options here actually. He could play either bishop d7 or king d8, which is interesting as usual, or the move I played, knight d7. After e takes f5, the game continued queen takes f5. White played bishop d3. I retreated with queen f7. White now tried a subtle move, knight b5, to which the only reply is king d8. There we are again. White played knight f3, black replied bishop g7, and white brought his last rook into the game, rook h e1, and black played rook f8. It's an interesting position. The black king is in the centre, but the two bishops are very important, and white's options are limited. He has very few ways to bring his pawns into play. He's got to do everything with pieces. He played king b1, and I played g5. Probably it was better to play a6, in fact. After 16 rook e4, I played queen f6. You've seen the threat, I hope. On b2. White played c4. Now I played queen f7. Now you may wonder why I've played queen f6 and then back to f7. Well, the reason was to force the move c4. This may seem a peculiar objective, but in fact it takes the square away from the white knight. After a6, knight a3, c4 would have been a nice potential square for that knight. Also the bishop on d3 is blocked by the pawn. White played rook d e1, and I used my key square on e5, knight e5. Moves like g5 prepare to secure the square e5 for black. White captured, knight takes e5. Black recaptured, bishop takes e5. Now, it would have been possible to sacrifice the exchange. The position would be completely unclear after rook takes e5. However, white played more positionally with f3, and I prevented any future possible sacrifice by playing bishop f6. From f6, the bishop defends the weak pawn on e7. Black's still got the two bishops, and quite a compact position now. White tried to mix things up by playing rook e6. This puts the rook on prise, of course, but it would be very risky to take it, since the white squares would suddenly become dangerous pathways for the white pieces to leap into action against the black king. I played b6, and white played bishop e4. This keeps leaving this rook on e6 on prise, and in fact it stays on prise for a hell of a long time, and I don't take it. Instead, I played bishop d7, just continuing my development. White played queen d3. I replied a6. White now played knight c3. This is probably a mistake. I think black's better after this move. Instead, queen a3 would have been completely unclear still. After queen g7, knight d1, I played king c7. White played g4, and now I played rook fb8. This is preparing the typical advance on the queen side with b5. Black's two bishops are now very solid. For a long time it's looked as though black has been defending, but now it's clear he has a big attack brewing. White played knight e3, and now it would be a mistake to take on b2 since e7 would be very loose. I played b5. White played queen a3, and now in some time trouble I started to lose the thread. Black should just play a5, building up this big attack. Instead, I initiated a tactical sequence with bishop takes b2. Now it's obvious enough if queen takes b2, black will play b takes c4, and the b file is decisive for black. But white played the better move, queen a5 check. I played king c8, Now the move I'd overlooked. King c2. Quite an easy move to overlook in time trouble. Now if I play b4, trying to bring my queen into the attack, white can just ignore it with knight f5, queen c3 check, and now king d1. The queen and bishop alone can only chase the white king to safety on the king side, and meanwhile black's king is in danger and e7 is falling off. So I played bishop f6, a defensive move looking after e7. White continued the attack with knight f5. I played queen f8. White now played bishop d3. This uncovers both rooks attacking e7 now. Finally, I played bishop takes e6. That rook's been on prise there for 12 moves. That might be some sort of record for an ongoing exchange sacrifice. White recaptured, rook takes e6. And I tried to simplify now with queen d8. White realised he shouldn't exchange queens and retreated, queen e1. And in return for the exchange, white has a real attack here. I played b takes c4, and I was banking on the variation knight takes d6 check, which would be a mistake. Black recaptures on d6, e takes d6. White can now win the black queen with rook e8. But black gets a fantastic position after c takes d3 check, king takes d3, bishop e5, when he'll have two rooks and a bishop against a queen and a completely won game. Instead of that, white played the excellent move, knight takes e7 check, which I'd completely overlooked. I have to capture back, bishop takes e7, and now a sort of quiet move, bishop f5. Now I have to run with my king. King c7, only move. Rook takes e7 check, king b6, a4. And although I've messed this game up, turning a one game into a completely unclear position, it's probably still equal before my next time trouble blunder, which was the horrible move queen h8. The only move instead of that was to play a5, which would have been unclear. Now white can play a5 himself, and indeed he did. a5 check, and I had to resign, since if I play king b5, bishop d7 is checkmate. This was actually the stem game renewing interest in the Clarendon court. Defeat cost me over $500, but the game was so interesting and spectacular that I hardly noticed. From a theoretical point of view, white needs to find an improvement in the chaotic early middle game, since as it went, black definitely got the advantage. Now, to give you a complete repertoire, we have to consider white's options other than 2d5. We'll deal with the least intimidating ones first. If 2e3, black has a whole range of moves. He could play g6, e6, knight f6, or just c takes d4. All of these are perfectly okay. Probably the most dynamic of these options is 2g6, when it looks as if white was terrified of the king's Indian or Benoni, and has chosen a passive line to avoid them. After 2g6, if white plays 3d takes c5, black just plays queen a5 check, and after 4 knight c3, he can simply recapture on c5, queen takes c5. More normal would be 3 knight f3, when black plays bishop g7, and white plays c4. Now if you play 4 knight f6 here, you'll get the sort of stodgy position your opponent is aiming for, judging by his play so far, that is. As usual, I'm going to recommend something more interesting. You can capture on d4, 4 c takes d4, white recaptures with the pawn, 5 e takes d4, and now black plays d6, the most flexible move. And the plan is to pressurise d4 by developing the queen's knight to c6, and the king's knight via h6 to f5. Notice the way this takes advantage of the move order, in that black has not already played knight f6, and can go the other way. A typical continuation might be 6 knight c3, bishop g4, This is consistent with the plan of attacking d4, since it pins one of its defenders. White plays 7 bishop e2, and you simply continue knight c6. And here, if white plays 8 d5, you can try bishop takes f3, white recaptures, bishop takes f3. Now you take control of the good square d4, knight d4. I think black's fine in this position. For example, after 10 bishop e3, you capture on f3, white recaptures with the queen, queen takes f3, and now black can even try bishop takes c3 check, white recaptures, b takes c3, and black plays queen c7. This attacks the pawn on c4. White can play bishop d4, then you just reply f6. May not look pretty, but white's pawn on c4 is a dreadful weakness. Going back to the position before white tried d5, another sensible option is bishop e3, defending the d4 pawn. Now you play the knight manoeuvre, knight h6, aiming for f5. In this dynamic and lively position, I think black has fully adequate chances. For example, after castles and knight f5, the pressure on d4 is already serious. If white plays d5, you take on f3, bishop takes f3, white recaptures, bishop takes f3, now you take on e3, knight takes e3, white recaptures, pawn takes e3, and then you play knight e5, and white's position is strategically lost. He has a bad bishop on f3, hemmed in by his own pawns. Black has an unopposed dark squared bishop and a superbly placed knight on the invulnerable square e5. Inevitably, white's going to lose a pawn. If white plays 2c3, well, try not to yawn. It's very quiet and absolutely no danger theoretically. At the Lloyds Bank Open in London 1994, Demis Hassabis played this way against me. The game continued 2e6, white played knight f3, black developed normally with knight f6, white played bishop g5, I played h6, white retreated with bishop h4, I played knight c6, and after e3, I exchanged on d4, c takes d4, white recaptured with the c-pawn, and I played queen b6, not worrying about the possible doubled pawns on the f-file if white should play bishop takes f6. White played the move queen c1, and I continued d5. Position's about equal, in fact 1 in 35 moves, but I don't think it's very relevant to Clarendon Court theory to go into it any further. As you can see, white hasn't achieved anything in this opening, and black's got no reason to fear this sort of setup. In the New York Open last year, one of my opponents tried 2 knight f3 against me. After taking on d4, c takes d4, white recaptured with the knight, and black played d5. White has already moved his knight twice in the opening, and black has every prospect of establishing a strong pawn centre. For example, after c4, black can play e5, since knight f3 is met by d4, and there's the old trick, if knight takes e5, you play queen a5 check, winning a piece. Instead of c4, white may simply play g3. Then you carry on as planned. e5, knight f3, and black plays knight c6. This is just the sort of position I was talking about. Black's good pawn centre gives him at least an equal game, probably a slight advantage in fact. Another move 2 choice for white is to d takes c5. Now black can get the pawn back with a comfortable game with e6. There is one line you should look at though. 3 knight c3, bishop takes c5, now white plays knight e4. White's trying to get the bishop pair here, but he loses too much time. Black just plays knight f6, white captures on c5, knight takes c5, queen a5 check, neat little trick that, queen d2, queen takes c5. Now white can try and swap the queens off with queen g5. fact, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings reckons this may be slightly better for white, but I don't agree. I think it's fine for black. Queen takes g5. White recaptures on g5. And now, improving on b6, given an ECO, black can play d5. And I think his position is just fine. The most enterprising alternative to d5 is definitely 2e4, trying to transpose into a Sicilian defence. If you play the Sicilian anyway, you've got absolutely nothing to worry about. But for the purposes of this repertoire, I'm going to assume that you know nothing about it at all, and that you're not prepared to learn it. After 2e4, c takes d4, you have to know how to handle two possibilities. After 3c3, you get a Moro gambit by transposition. You have to take d takes c3, and after knight takes c3, I'm going to recommend a simple and clear way of playing this for black. Knight c6, knight f3, d6, bishop c4, e6, white castles, black develops the bishop, bishop e7. The secret to this system is to remember to delay the development of the king's knight. This takes the sting out of the Moro completely. After queen e2, black goes a6, white plays rook d1, now bishop d7, you're planning to play rook c8, white goes bishop f4, now you play e5, white plays bishop e3, and finally knight f6. And because of black's move order, he has a comfortable position. If the knight was on f6 earlier, white could have played the bishop to g5 without losing time. The other option for white is to play knight f3, aiming for an open Sicilian. But black can avoid mainline theory and exploit the strange move order in either of two ways. One is to play 3a6, with the idea of 4 knight takes d4, e5. Now, in the normal O'Kelly Sicilian, after 1 e4, c5, 2 knight f3, a6, white can avoid all this and play the simple move 3c3. But with this move order, black doesn't have that problem. The other line, which I would play myself, is 3e5. Spot the trap. If knight takes e5, black has queen a5 check. Whoops. The best move is 4c3. And this time, if you take on c3, white gets a good Moro. But black plays 4, knight c6. And this is actually quite an active move. The main idea is that after 5 pawn takes pawn, black replies e takes d4, white goes knight takes d4, and black plays knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn. After knight c3, black plays bishop b4, with active piece play. White cannot both defend e4 and leave black with a weak d-pawn. I think it's about equal after 8, knight takes c6, d takes c6. Instead of taking on d4, white can try the interesting move 5 bishop c4. It's already on the edge of theory. My own analysis goes knight f6, and now white has two moves. If he goes c takes d4, black recaptures, e takes d4, white plays e5, black has the good move now d5, with a slight advantage in my opinion. Or, after 6 knight g5, black plays d5, white captures, e takes d5. Now black shouldn't capture back with knight takes d5 because of queen f3. Instead he plays knight a5, and after bishop b5 check, bishop d7, queen a4, I think the best move here is b6. Now white can capture on d4, c takes d4, black recaptures, e takes d4, and if white castles, black just plays bishop e7, and if bishop takes d7 check, black can take back with the knight, knight takes d7, and he has absolutely no problems. Even if you don't play the Sicilian, I think you've got absolutely nothing to worry about. These lines seem fine for black. In my opinion, only 2d5 represents a real threat. The above analysis is enough to turn the Clarendon Court into a complete repertoire against 1d4. So there you have it. You now know practically all the theory there is, and you've seen most of my home analysis too. I hope you're feeling confident enough to give it a try. There are several positive factors to encourage you. It has real surprise value, it completely disorientates opponents, so you should gain plenty of time on the clock, and it will probably be several years before it becomes mainline theory, so throughout that period you'll have a knowledge advantage over every new opponent that you play. I think it also makes an excellent alternative to safer, sounder openings, like the Queen's Gambit Declined orthodox defence. It may not be as positionally sound, but there are far better winning chances. Besides, you should get more interesting and original positions to play. Good luck with the Clarendon Court in your own games.